Hey, this is Brian Jackson, and I am an attorney in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I run a firm called Brian K. Jackson LLC, and we specialize in employment law. And I just wanted to create this podcast to talk a little bit more about employment law. And this podcast is specifically focused on a wrongful termination claim if there's not any discrimination involved under a protected class such as sex, race, religion, gender, disability, maternity leave. If there's no protections under state law, then yes, one of the questions is, okay, if I'm terminated, what are my rights? And I've put up a podcast generally that kind of talks about the at-will doctrine. And in that podcast, we talked about how with the at-will doctrine, that is the de facto where both sides can terminate the business relationship for whatever reason at any time. And we talked about how there are some caveats if you have a contract or if there's a verbal communication that indicates that your status is above the at-will status. I wanted to dig deeper a little into that and what some individual rights might be if someone is terminated. And I guess specifically speaking, if an employer approaches an individual and says, we're terminating you, and there's really no discriminatory basis, that could be a valid termination. And a lot of it depends on the facts as well, and there also can be some additional caveats there too, because there are companies that have their own employment handbooks, and depending on how the employment handbook is written, it might create a contractual process where the company has to jump through a few hoops before they can terminate an individual. And the example that I noted, if the employer just goes up and says you're terminated, some employee handbooks still note the at-will status, and in that situation, usually there's no recourse. However, sometimes companies feel like they need to come up with a reason for the termination to justify it. Under the at-will doctrine, essentially you don't have to come up with a reason to breach the contract, but they still do, and that can cause problems for the company as well, because there could be issues on whether or not the reasons they state are actually justified reasons, and if there's a substantial basis for them. And then also, if they're terminating you for a reason, even though an employee handbook might say at will, it might change the status to a different status as to there might be some policy in there. If we're terminating you for cause, there's some certain hoops that we have to jump through first, whereas an individual, they might have a first verbal warning, a written warning, probation, something like that, and then ultimately, very end, last straw, you're terminated. And a lot of companies claim, well, even though we have that process, it's still at will, and so we can terminate you at will. And that's kind of the fight there in those cases, and it's a trickier case, but based on the language, I mean, it could be enough to prevail to say that you had to go through this process based on your internal policies and procedures before terminating you. And because you didn't go through those policies and procedures, you broke our contract, and because of that, it was a wrongful termination. So that's kind of a caveat as well that you can go through. Also, a lot of people have asked questions about retaliation that isn't related to a protected class. For example, if somebody files a complaint against a supervisor, they have concerns about how the supervisor is running the show, and then thereafter supervisor makes the atmosphere hostile, treats the individual differently, belittles them, does certain things to those individuals. The question is whether or not those actions, whether or not someone has a valid cause of action under retaliation. And again, it's a little bit trickier with the at-will doctrine, but there is a cause of action in Utah law called the breach of good faith and fair dealing. And what that is, it's an action where if someone has, where under a contract there's an implied covenant that both parties will not obstruct the fruits of a contract of another individual, and them receiving the fruits and benefits of the contract. And so if so you might be able to claim that your supervisor is intentionally interfering with the rights of your contract and trying to find a way to terminate you, or trying to find a way where where you just feel like you want to quit because you don't like working with that particular supervisor anymore. So there could be a cause of action there. There's also a cause of action for intentional interference with economic relations, where if you can show that supervisor intentionally interfered with your work and terminated you or made life really intolerable for you, where you quit, or you weren't able to get certain promotions, or you weren't able to do your job properly, stuff like that, or where you wrote you up for reasons that really weren't justified or frivolous, then you might have some cause of action as well there. Also, if there has been false accusations against you, you might have a defamation claim, and for your reputation that's been harmed based off your employability, that you could bring as well under that. So as far as retaliation, usually retaliation is only focused on if you made a complaint regarding something related to discrimination, or you were part of the process of discrimination, and then because of you being part of the process, or making a complaint, and they do some adverse action against you, then that can be retaliation based on a protected interest. So you might, even if you're not the one that's discriminated against based off race, it could be possible that if you're the one who the complaint was made against based off a racial discrimination claim of someone else, and you were retaliated against, like you were terminated before an investigation was closed, you're demoted, or the situation became hostile. Because of that, you might have a retaliation case as well as a result of that. So, yeah, I think that's as far as I'll go with that. If you have any additional questions or want to reach out to us, feel free to reach out at our office or visit our website at bjacksonlaw.com.